when you were when you knew that you had a class coming up or something, you would do your due diligence and really work hard on understanding, okay, if I'm going to be taking a class on this book of the Bible for school, one way to really help me dig into the text is to learn it well enough to teach it at church. And you did that. I know with Revelation, I think also with Hebrews also, which is a tough book to work through for a church audience. Hebrews 11 is fun, right? Faith Hall of Fame. There's some good stuff in Hebrews 12, but the rest of the book, it's kind of a slugfest of theology and Christology and stuff like that. But you started teaching Revelation and have had a couple of opportunities to teach it since then. What what common preconceptions, ideas, maybe misconceptions have you noticed that people tend to bring to the book of Revelation when they are hearing it in a church context?
Sure. I mean, it's really polarizing. So my context is Churches of Christ, and that's mostly the groups that I'm talking with. I would say a dominant kind of position is the one that I grew up with, which is it's too difficult, it's too crazy, there is no relevance for this. I mean, I grew up knowing that the message was for the seven churches and the people in the past, and therefore I concluded there was no relevance for me.
Interesting.
And so I think a lot of people have a default uh, position of I just staying away from this. It's too
Yeah.
hard. It's too confusing. It's too crazy. But then on the other hand, someone actually just told me the other day, they said, if anybody ever comes up to you at church and says, I really want to teach the book of Revelation, never let that person. um, and the
I
reason,
know the type.
yeah, yeah. So then the opposite end of the spectrum is that Revelation is this basically book of codes that sort of tells you how to predict the end of the world
Hmm.
and sort of the last times. And it you might call it reading Revelation like it's predictive prophecy of the future.
Hmm.
And so it really becomes almost this like book of secrets where you need the 1 a.m. televangelist to decode that this passage is about China and Russia and sort of this modern day thing that's happening right now, or Israel and Palestine shooting rockets at each other. You really see, and so while in our pocket of churches there may be more avoidance, that other strand of the left behind and the end times and the book of codes.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had American presidents who in presidential candidates who in national debates have talked about things like Armageddon. And so
Yeah.
I mean it has really that one in terms of American politics and American evangelicalism and American life, that end times view has really taken hold. And I don't know if you want me to comment on that, but I'll just say one thing. I think people are surprised to learn that that way of understanding Revelation is a book of codes where you pick one verse from Revelation and one verse from Daniel and one verse from Ezekiel, and somehow that makes some kind of system in the Schofield Bible that people might. I think people would be surprised to learn that that is a newer idea than the United States of America itself.
Yeah,
That
dig into that a little bit. Folks might also not know the particular study Bible you're referring to, the Schofield Bible, SCO Field, Schofield.
yeah,
Would you mind digging into that just a little bit for
sure.
us?
I mean, I grew up in a house where like we didn't believe in that, but we still had a Schofield Bible. I think everybody kind of had a Schofield Bible,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people would be familiar with that. But John Nelson Darby is the guy who is credited with sort of this way of thinking. He is in the late 1800s and is over in Great Britain,
Mm.
and so he actually travels here to the U.S. And prior to this kind of what's been called dispensationalism, or um, prior to him bringing that over, that was not present anywhere. And John Nelson Darby kind of comes up with that. He comes over here. There's a system. There's a series of events that happen that I think the most major one was one of the major preachers at the time was Moody, after
Hmm.
whom today like Moody Bible Institute is named
Yeah.
after. And John Nelson Darby heard him preach, and afterward kind of went up to him and scolded him. So a lot of preachers have had this experience, but he scolded him for being soft on prophecy.
Uh-huh.
He's like, I liked everything else you said. You just don't get prophecy right. And so after a few conversations, Moody was actually kind of convinced by his system. And then when you have a Bible Institute that's training guys that are going to go out into the rest of the country, that is that's how it spread. But it's really a relatively new, way of thinking about how the texts, what they're meant to be doing.
Yeah.
And I would also say it's not an ancient way
Right. Yeah.
of doing this. So, yeah.
So if you were to go back, say, to the group of folks known as the Apostolic Fathers or later patristics, these guys would present interpretations of Revelation very different from what Darby presented and eventually was popularized by folks coming out of the Moody Bible Institute. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about Revelation is it presents itself as being a message delivered to 7 churches in Asia Minor.
Mm-hmm.
And the crazy thing that happens with this way of reading that John Nelson Darby brought over is we then interpret Revelation as if it were written to 21st century Western America,
Mm-hmm.
so that everything in Revelation, the fulfillment of those, just also happen to be the geopolitical foes of the United States of America. So it's Russia and China and all these things. And so the litmus test I like to give when I present on Revelation is, if your interpretation of Revelation would not make sense to someone sitting in a pew in Smyrna in the 1st century, it is not correct. And so I'm sorry to inform you, but no one would have been able to understand that the beast was Barack Obama or Donald Trump.
Right.
That just is not a right way to read Revelation. And when you look at the history, it's actually a very recent way. And I'm not, just because Nicolas Cage has thrown all of his cinematic weight behind a new movie of the Left Behind series, and just because the Left Behind series sells so popularly in our culture, if you really look at what is behind that series, it's such a new. And by the way, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but
it's all right.
The series, like Left Behind, was based on like late great Planet Earth and Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins and those guys.
Yeah.
Well, when they wrote that, they were writing as if all the prophecies in the Bible and in Revelation were being fulfilled during the period of the Cold War. And so Russia, well, either that did or didn't happen. And it appears like it didn't happen. And so the goalpost just keeps moving. Like it's always a different nation or fulfillment or whatever, but people keep staying within the system. And that I think it should give us a warning that this is a problematic way to try to understand these texts.